Hello, everyone. Good day, and thank you for joining us for episode 24 already of Unsung Heroes of the Cloud, where today we have Matt and Harvey joining us to discuss Internet Protocol, or simply IP address management. Matt and Harvey, thanks for joining us. How are you today?
Doing well.
Doing well, thank you.
So
How's the
before
heat
we
over there?
The heat
It's
over in San Jose.
Yeah, because we had a heat stroke here in Belgium yesterday, so that was a lot of fun. But you guys are
Uh,
probably accustomed to that.
I hope you had a
um,
heat wave and not a heat stroke, because those are two
yeah,
different
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
actually, it was for a lot of people. It was a stroke. Trust me,
Oh
you should
boy.
see the news. We're not used to that.
My goodness.
so
All fine.
Matt, Harvey, our audience doesn't know you. Why don't you quickly introduce yourself and tell us what you like to do for fun? Maybe Harvey, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name's Harvey Bendana. I'm a principal technical architect, and I work out of our Seattle-based Microsoft Technology Center. Um, when I'm not hacking code and doing architectural design sessions with our customers, I love baseball. I'm a huge baseball fan. I love riding my bike, and obviously, I love spending time with my children.
And when you say baseball, watching or playing or both?
Both. Although I don't get to play in the big leagues, but I do play on rec softball teams. I help coach my son's baseball team, and you'll often catch me on a Saturday just out on an empty baseball field taking some cuts.
Yeah.
Cool.
A
That
field
sounds like
day.
a ton of fun. And Matt, you also play baseball?
Yes, if baseball is not playing baseball and eating pizza, then I play baseball for sure.
So you're doing the sidetrack of the baseball thing, just watching it,
Yeah,
and
I'm more in the stands enjoying a lot of the snacks and refreshments. That's kind of my speed of baseball, or any sport for that matter. But anywho, I am Matthew Garrett. I'm a cloud solution architect. I actually work very closely with Nils quite often on various things here over at Azure. But in my spare time, I do like being outdoors, trying to get away from, like he said, the heat stroke, just chilling out. I used to do a lot of hiking and backpacking. Then kids came along, and life's a little bit different now. But looking forward to getting back into that as soon as possible, because it was always really nice just to be one with nature.
if it can be any comfort, it will come back once they get older
I
and
believe
wiser.
you. I'm just waiting. I'm not
Although
sure what. Yeah, I'm not sure when, but couldn't come soon enough.
diapers first, and before you know it, they start walking, taking your car, and saying, "Bye, Dad. See you next week." That's how
Asking
life
for
goes.
iTunes money.
Uh, we're not that, but anyway. So IPAM, or I
Yes.
think we can call it. What do you have for us
Yep.
in stock with that?
Sure. So maybe I'll take a first crack at here to kind of frame it up, if that's all right, and then we'll get into some goodies. So when I've been in the networking space before I came to Microsoft for quite some time, and so there are some things that we just expect from that side of the house. Obviously, there's DNS, there's DHCP, but one of the key things is IP address management. And the reason this is important is, as you look at your real estate that you own as far as data center space and maybe sites that are out there, it's very important when we're going to connect these together that IP addresses do not overlap. And so we need some way of tracking these kind of at large in our environment. And that's just something that's been critical to most of the environments I've worked on, both as a customer and on the other side of the fence. So when I joined Microsoft and I started digging in and really kind of wetting my palate on some of the networking space and how things were different in the cloud, one of the first things I kind of looked at and started getting feedback from customers is, how do you see all of your IP space? Because you run into a situation very quickly, and I'll give you an example. You are a company, you decide to go all in on any cloud provider, pick a name, whoever it is. We'll use Azure for this example. And you
Mhm.
start allowing your end users to create subscriptions. And in those subscriptions, they want to start building an infrastructure. And so what do most people do who don't really understand the intimate details of networking? They create a VNet, they hit next, and next thing you know, you have 710,000/16 networks. And so that's not a big deal until you want to implement things like ExpressRoute or VPN, and all of a sudden it becomes a huge deal because you didn't know this and you can't really link those together very well.
Yeah.
So
that's troublesome.
Yeah. So that's kind of framing it up, to say the least. Yes. So Harvey and I have met a while back, and our kind of side gig or side hustle, if you may, is starting to look at gaps. And Nils can probably attest to this through other things that I've worked with him on, and finding these gaps in the offerings and fixing them. And so the advent was to come out with some sort of IP address management. We kind of came up with this idea during a hackathon, and we said, all right, well, what does this look like? So I don't want to spend too much time drilling on the nuances. I do want to spend at least 2 minutes kind of talking about what this looks like as far as an architectural or kind of a high-level design. And that way you can understand how it gets implemented in your environment. And then I'll turn it over to Harvey to give you all the stuff you really are paying to see today, which is the bells and whistles and blinky lights. So
and
in
Matt,
traditional IPAM system, sorry, go ahead.
If I can interrupt you before you start, IPAM, is this something like an Azure service, or what actually is IPAM, and how does a customer use this?
Sure. So the intention in the long run is there will be something native in Azure, bottom line. Until then, what Harvey and I have built is an open source project. And this project can be acquired from our GitHub, which I'm sure we'll put a link to or something here before the end of the stream. And so it's something that's relatively easy to deploy. Harvey and I have spent quite a bit of time making sure that the scripts that are used to deploy it are as drop-dead simple as possible. And in fact, we've had a number of customers surprise us by saying, hey, we're running this solution. Thanks for this. It works great. And we're like, I didn't even know you were using it, but that's really good news. That answer your question?
Yes.
It answered my question. Thank you.
Awesome. So we'll flip back to that before the very end and let everyone know how to grab it. But very quick, I want to frame this up. So for those who are and maybe are not familiar with the ins and outs, we're all familiar with virtual networks and subnets and the endpoints that live in them. That should be pretty bread and butter by now, regardless of what cloud you work in. But some of the lower level pieces that really facilitate IP address management, we want to separate things out. And the first thing I had mentioned is being able to connect these networks together. And what that implies is unique IP address space on both sides. And so if we look at the diagram here, this is where a space comes in. Other providers of IP address management, which there are plenty out there that do a really wonderful job. The reason we're kind of in this space is all of those that we've looked at are very traditional on-premises IP address management, and their solutions are really tuned to that environment. And sometimes that doesn't translate exactly into a cloud environment. So for us, when we decided to bring this to life, it was take the essence of those and modify that so it made sense, especially in the Azure world. So here you see something called a space. The idea of a space is it is a unique set of IP addresses. So anything that is in a space, that's going to be unique. There's not going to be any overlap of IP address in there. And then you have blocks. And what blocks are is really, as network admins or the NetApps team, these are a big set of IP addresses that we then give to the users of IPAM and say, you can carve this up freely and you can make new virtual networks and of course subnets off of that, because we know these are unique. And so you can enable a self-service through those. So that's pretty much it. If there's any questions on this, otherwise we'll get to the meat and potatoes.
So is this something a customer would all have to set up themselves in IPAM, or does IPAM have the ability to somewhat fetch all of this information from Azure on a customer's behalf?
That's a great question. I'll half answer that and I'll turn it over to Harvey because I think this is a good segue. The answer is, at this moment, we haven't really thought about making some brownfield assumptions where we can just kind of take a look at everything. Definitely would love to do that, and we might need to borrow one of our AI/ML counterparts to help make some intelligent decisions when looking at the data to say what things likely go together. But for now, it's relatively straightforward to start building out these building blocks. And Harvey's going to take it away and show you all the goodies right now.
Cool. Thanks.
All right.
Looking forward.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, perfectly
Excellent.
clear.
All right. So welcome to IPAM. We'll cover everything that Matt talked about around spaces, blocks, and then VNet associations. But we want to start here on our landing page, and a couple of things I want you to notice. So first off, we are using Azure Active Directory authentication. So one of the key things we wanted to run with here is we don't want a separate process for authentication and authorization. We didn't want to create a whole different process for role-based access control. So we leverage Azure AD. If I was logged into the Microsoft tenant, you would obviously see my small little avatar, but here we're using a test tenant. But you'll see it's HB, those are my initials, so I'm logged in, and there's a couple of things that you might want to notice here. We have the ability to dial in the refresh rate of the data that we get. By default, we refresh our data every 5 minutes, but if you want to back that off and have it occur at 10, 15, or 30, you have the ability to do so here. The other thing I want you to notice is the ability to capture a token. So I'll show you the UI today. I'll also show you our GitHub repo, but keep in mind that IPAM also has a fully functional RESTful API. So with a token provisioned by Azure Active Directory, I can begin to interface with IPAM in a programmatic way. So when we think about that from an enterprise perspective, that becomes very powerful, right? Sure, we're going to go into the UI and do onesie-twosies, but the reality is if I need to provision environments on a regular basis, I want to be able to do this in a programmatic fashion, and we give you the ability to do that with IPAM. Okay, so let's start checking things out here. When you first enter IPAM, you authenticate, and there are a couple of things you need to do. Number one is you need to define who your administrators are going to be. Our permission model works in a way where we use the MSAL library. Basically, we will do authentication on your behalf, and we will only show you what you are provisioned and allowed to see within Azure. Meaning, if I have contributor at a subscription level, then I will be able to see everything with regards to networking at that subscription level. If I only have contributor at a specific resource group, then that's all I'm going to be able to see in IPAM, unless I'm defined as an administrator. If I'm defined as an administrator, as you see myself and Matthew here, then the tool uses a service principal, and at time of deployment, you define the scope of the tool's entirety, meaning I want this tool to handle everything under my tenant or everything under a specific subscription. So once an administrator is defined, my permissions are then handled on my behalf by that service principal. So then I have the ability to read everything from a network perspective at that top level scope that I define at time of deployment. So once you've defined your administrators, this is where you come in and start to create what we call spaces. And again, they're logical containers for you to put blocks of IP addresses in. But if we peruse some of these spaces, you'll see that some blocks show up with some CIDR blocks or CIDR addresses. And so this is where you begin defining these blocks that are associated with spaces. You'll notice that you can have the same CIDR block as long as they are in independent spaces. We don't want to have to deal with IP address overlap. So each block has to be unique within a space. Okay. Let's see here. Let's take a look at one of these blocks from a current configuration standpoint. So a couple of concepts here. One is seeing the virtual networks that are assigned to this block. So as you can see, you'll notice a lot of different VNets across various subscriptions. So as part of the deployments tool, we've defined a scope at a tenant level. So we want to be able to manage all network componentry across the entire tenant of this particular instance of Azure. And so I have the ability here through the UI to come in and simply negotiate a VNet with an existing block. Now you'll notice that there is no address overlap because if I try to associate a block that would cause an overlap, I'll get an error message saying, hey, we can't do this. This address space is already consumed in this block. So we have thought about that because, of course, when you think about networking from an enterprise fashion and some of the comments that Matthew had earlier, we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner, so to speak, when we're ready to move on to things like transitive routing across regions or hybrid connectivity back to your on-premises. So now let's go look at the discovery piece. So as a user of IPAM, what would this look like? And we break it up into obviously all the logical containers that we have. But here's all our spaces, excuse me. And as part of the space, we will tell you the total IP address space that you have provisioned for the space, and of that, how much of it is consumed. So you see some visuals here as far as consumption is concerned. And you can drill in and get some more details from a space perspective as far as IP address consumption and just details about the space in general. Now we'll move on to blocks. And so as you'll see, we're going to drill down further and we'll get more detail as we go through this. Blocks, same thing. So these are those large blocks of IP address space that we associate to spaces. You'll notice here that you'll be able to see what space the block is associated to. And again, you'll get some IP address utilization information as well. Drilling into each block, you'll get a similar visual. We'll give you CIDR information and just details about the block itself. So here's where it starts to get interesting. So here's all the VNets that reside within the tenant that this tool is managing for us. And you'll notice that some of these are assigned blocks and some of them aren't. And so this is the concept of what we call a reservation. So we have the ability, when we create that association between a VNet and a block that we've defined in the tool, we've created in essence a reservation for those two to be associated. And so here you'll see information on the VNet, obviously the resource name, utilization information from an IP address allocation perspective. And here's where we want to keep you in the flow, so to speak. So here you'll see some key details that we're actually retrieving from Azure. And in a minute here, I'll tell you how we do all this. But the other thing we want to do is we want you to be able to hop into Azure, keep that flow going, so to speak. So we give you the ability to tap into the portal and look at that actual VNet that we've been talking about within IPAM and managing within IPAM. I want you to notice this tag here, which is IPAM reservation ID. This is a tag ID that's a unique ID created within the tool. And once we create that association between a VNet and a block, this tag is what defines that association. So IPAM has the ability to, once that association is created, provision that tag for you on your resource. And then as we continue to drill down, you can then begin to see subnet information. And just as you would expect, we'll tell you which VNet these subnets are associated to. We'll give you IP address utilization information. And again, same deal. Key information around the resource itself, retrieved from Azure, and then the ability to stay in the flow, so to speak, and be able to see that resource within the Azure portal directly. Okay. And then lastly, our endpoints. So it's natural, as you would assume, as we continue to drill down through the VNet and the subnet, we also want to know information about any endpoints that are created within our ecosystem. So again, we'll tell you what the parent subnet is for that endpoint, the parent obviously, what resource group it resides in, and then key information around that particular endpoint itself. Primarily, it's private and public IP, resource group, membership, and then what subscription it's associated to within Azure. And again, we want to keep you in the flow, so we give you the ability to drill into that resource natively within the Azure portal. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, how is it that I'm retrieving all of this information? So we are leveraging Microsoft Resource Graph API. So all these calls that you see, all this data that's retrieved, and that we saw earlier, which is refreshed every 5 minutes, we're handling with Resource Graph calls on the back end. quickly
That's cool.
here.
Resource graph is beautiful. I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
not too many people are using it and should be using it more and more. We actually did an episode completely on that. I think there was a second one, right? Those are the first one even.
I don't recall. Let's go through our episode history because we've got 24 now, Mike.
Indeed. But just saying that you beautifully picked up with resource graph there. Love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, during design phase, we thought about, leveraging PowerShell, leveraging the CLI or one of our SDKs. But just because of the volume of data or the potential volume of data that we're retrieving, we didn't want to exhaust or trigger API throttles. And so the best course of action for us was to leverage the resource graph. It's a very easy way for you to capture massive amounts of data with, one fairly simple API call. So all of this is occurring on what we call the backend portion of our tool. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to take you to our GitHub repo. Very simple to remember, github.com/azure/IPAM. We have all of our code base here. Give me a few seconds and I'll describe how this infrastructure is laid out. But you'll be able to capture everything here. There's even samples of how to leverage the RESTful API for our tool in case you perform some of these actions programmatically. And then, of course, we have some documentation. And when we dive into our documentation, one of the first screens that we show you here, whoops, my apologies, is our architecture diagram. Let me see if I can zoom this in a little bit. But at a high level, the way this works is we're comprised of two containers. We have a front-end container that handles all of the UI, and that's written in Node.js with React. And then we have a back-end container, which is doing all the heavy lifting, making calls to the resource graph API, and handling all of the MSAL work, the AD authentication, role-based access control, all the heavy lifting of the tool. And that's a container that's written in Python.
Python. Yep.
Correct. Yeah. And so as far as metadata for our backend, we're leveraging Azure Cosmos DB. So that's where we're storing all of those things like those unique IDs for reservations, space information, block information, and then all of the metadata that handles association of the actual resources in Azure, like the VNets and the endpoints, to our logical containers of space blocks. All secrets are stored in Key Vault. And so the two containers right now run within an app service. And of course, our app service is leveraging a managed identity. And that's how it's retrieving information from Key Vault, as well as retrieving and interfacing with Cosmos DB. The entire solution is deployed with bicep files and some fairly lightweight deployment scripts in PowerShell. And so one of the things that we had to consider was deployment models, right? Of course, I would love to be able to deploy everything from the get-go, the whole package, soup to nuts. But sometimes users might not want to have a front-end UI, right? They might have different plans for that. Or in some cases, they might not want to run this within app service, especially if all you're going to do is run the back end. And so we've designed the tool so that you can separate those two components. They're still fully functional. And we're working on being able to provision the engine piece, so the core piece of the tool, in basically any platform that you'd like, whether it's app services, whether it's Azure Functions, whether it's container instances, or whether it's container apps. So the whole idea is for this to be flexible so that it can fit into your existing environment and existing workflow. Or if you want to use the whole tool fresh out of the box, you have the ability to do so. One last thing I'd like to show you all is our API. Oops. Let me refresh that.
API/docs. Yeah.
There you go. Thank you. I had it backwards. API/docs. So like I said earlier, we have a fully functional API. It's fully documented here via Swagger. So anything and everything that you saw me do through the UI, you have the ability to do programmatically via our RESTful APIs. And like I said, in our GitHub repo, we have a sample. If you look in the deploy directory, you'll notice some information about landing zone integration. So we have done a very simple example of how you might leverage IPAM to help you provision landing zones in accordance with our Azure landing zone documentation. So when you provision a landing zone, one of the things you need to provision is, of course, some VNets. So we simply injected IPAM into the process and leveraged the API to be able to request a reservation from a block, meaning a small chunk of IP address space, and then based on that reservation, create a VNet and create that association long-term. So then the VNet gets created and it gets associated to a block in the IPAM tool automatically. We're working on
That's so
a
cool.
lot of, yeah, it's super cool. We're working on some more examples on how to integrate the tool into workflows that we know exist today in the enterprise from a networking perspective.
Because that's one thing. If we do a full CAF deployment with enterprise landing zones, you get a lot of IP management to go over to, and this will really help you better take a look at how things are working. And a lot of people just lose the forest with all the
Let me give
trees.
you an even better example, right? We have this whole move around CAF and landing zones. So you go, you deploy landing zones. It's supposed to make it automagic, right? And then you go to deploy a landing zone and you need a VNet. So you got to put in a ticket, you got to wait 48 hours, and then you can finally deploy your landing zone. To me, that doesn't seem very efficient. And that's exactly why Harvey and I went through this is, as he said, now we just inject it into the scripts in that landing zone deployment, calls out to IPAM, gets an IP back, Bob's your uncle.
Yep.
Very nice.
It makes perfect sense, and it keeps that manual step out of the workflow. I want to be able to do this completely programmatically from beginning to end. Last thing I want to show you is a neat little visualization that we threw into the tool. We're always working on making this better and more purpose-built, but it's just a nice little visualization that takes you through all the levels of your space, your block, and then the VNets that live within those blocks and that are associated to your space and your block accordingly. So
That's pretty neat.
A couple of subnets. And you'll be able to drill down further to see endpoints and information like that.
I actually thought you put a joke in there because when I saw it on screen, I thought it resembled a small network cable. With all the different colors.
a little slice of fiber for you all.
Yeah, exactly. UTP. Sorry.
No worries.
No, but the visualization actually looks very neat because it helps show you potential holes in your network assignment or gaps that you have there. So that looks really, really cool, guys. Good job.
Yeah.
So are you talking to any of the teams about this, like the network management guys and like the guys that are doing the network topology and security parts in Defender for Cloud?
We absolutely are. I'm going to hand that over to Matt because Matt's been doing a lot of the conversation with that team. But we're in very close communication with the networking team. Lots of interest in the work that we've been doing here. So Matt, why don't you give us a little purview of what's going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, as Harvey was saying, we've been doing the IPAM roadshow around Microsoft here for the last couple of months, and it's been quite a journey. So just to give kind of a little more information there, definitely been working with some of the internal product groups on how does this product fit in maybe in the interim as an integration point until something does come natively in Azure, and maybe the idea of some of the constructs that we've built, because we're already working with customers, taking that feedback and learning and putting it into whatever that becomes. The second piece is working with the landing zone and CAF and WAF teams on integrating this solution already into CAF and WAF and landing zones so that customers can start leveraging this out of the box, which would be really, really nice. And so there's a few others, maybe some internal teams that also have been looking for these types of solutions, which is also why we've been focusing on and other paradigms such as running this as a function where users say, I don't care about the user file. I want to run it somewhere relatively cheap, I'll function, and we're off to the races, and we can start auditing our deployments internally for different processes at Microsoft.
Neat, neat. I also am already very happy to see that it's underneath the Azure organization in GitHub. That means that we get actually you laugh, Nils, but actually that gives
Yeah.
you more benefit for more people using it because they will see it as an official product, which is cool. Which is something that I will also put into my toolshed deck from now on, because this is really a cool tool. This is something that we've been missing out for a long time. Very nice. Well done, gentlemen. Really nice played.
Thank you. Yeah, the feedback has been nothing but phenomenal, and it makes us feel like we're definitely down the right path, because a lot of folks that we've been working with, it's just exactly your sentiment that this has been long in the tooth coming, and it's about time.
I
You
got a
felt
really. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Nils.
Yeah, you felt the pain and you applied not just a band-aid, but you build a whole cost around that pain. Good job.
That's right.
We found a bag of peanuts, so we built a plane around it. It's much more comfortable
right.
now.
Oh, that's a good one, fun bag of food. Well, it was flying mid-air. Whee! Say, I got another question. Do you see anything happening here also in that other space that we're doing, like the hybrid thingy, with things like the networking stack over there? Do you see any benefits of maybe porting it over to that part too?
Yes-ish. So you bring up another really good point, and this is something that Harvey and I have been working on customers is, okay, cool. Let's say I'm a customer. I have an existing IP address management today. It does its work on premises, and that's mostly managed by the networking team or the NetOps team. And then I come in, we're the cloud team, we're standing up Azure, AWS, whoever it is, right? I love this IPAM solution. We get it deployed. How do we connect those things together? And so this was something that a customer actually brought to us that Harvey and I are working on, is things like integration, import and export from this IPAM solution into the other traditional ones that are out there in the market.
Okay, I was really more referring to our hybrid solutions like ACI and ARC enablement of all these elements. Are you seeing anything there that you're gonna do?
Well, I think, just to very quickly answer that, I think vicariously, especially when it comes to ARC, those items are onboarded and they become an Azure resource. And as such, IPAM already sees Azure resources. One of the things I would check is to make sure that we're actually querying ARG properly for some of the IP information that we get back from that ARC resource. So I think that's kind of already baked in. Anything that ends up as an Azure resource, we can see already through ARG. As far as things like Azure Stack or maybe Azure Stack Edge, that's a good question. I think that's very valuable, especially in maybe like service provider space, where if I have a bunch of 5G POP locations, hundreds or thousands of them, how do I manage my IP address space across those? And I think that is a fantastic challenge, and I'm ready for it. So we'll see.
That was indeed what I was aiming for. So yeah, nice. All right. Any more bag of peanuts that we're gonna build in the near future?
Well, we'll see. We gotta finish the lavatory and the plane here, so round it all out with a nice cockpit. Harvey, is there anything you wanted to wrap up with?
No, I would just say, check out the GitHub repo. Talk to your customers about it. We're loving all the feedback that we're getting, and as we all know, it's all about the feedback loop. So the more usage we see, the more feedback we get, the better we can make the tool. So,
yeah,
100%.
And then, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
So I'd say first and foremost, we have the GitHub repo. So we have GitHub discussions are there, and you can of course open issues. But also we have a link to a mailer that includes myself and Harvey if you want to have more of a direct discussion. I would say my guidance, and Harvey, keep me honest, is if it's around the product, again, around feature set or things that you'd like to see or maybe some thoughts, that's a great place for GitHub discussions. If it's an issue that you're seeing or a bug, open that up in a GitHub issue. And if it's just you want to say, hey, or you have something unique that maybe doesn't belong in a public space of GitHub, you can email Harvey and I, and we'll respond ASAP.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you. Before we start any more metaphors about planes or peanuts, I think this is a good place to round things up. Matt, Harvey, thanks for joining us today. And for those who have watched up to this point, thank you for sticking along. Try out IPAM. We'll put the links into the description, and we'll see you all in about 2 weeks. Thanks,
Yep.
everyone.
Thanks so
Bye,
much. Have a
everybody.
great
Thank
day.
you, everybody.
Bye.